Today, let's expand on the 600 index. When we go to the DOT website for the 600 index, there's actually a built-in quick reference guide for the MOT section. So let's click on the link, scroll down to the 600 section and go to the quick reference sheet. Okay, the first table we want to look at here is the channelizing device spacing. Now, what this refers to is our cone spacing, the distance or the maximum distance that the cones can be apart when we're setting up a lane closure. First in the taper as well as the tangent sections, which is the straight sections. In unpacking this first table, we look to the far left and we see work zone speeds in the miles per hour. It's basically saying anything 45 miles an hour or less or 50 miles an hour and greater. The spacing between the cones or the tubular markings in the taper area can only be 25 feet maximum distance apart, but in the straight sections they can be up to 50 feet apart. Now let's move on to table 2, taper lengths. You can see that the speed is broke down from equals 40 miles an hour or less or equals or greater than 45. So starting at the far left, we see the speeds broke down starting from 25 miles an hour up to 70 miles per hour. And as you work across, you see it's a 4-foot wide lane, a 5-foot wide lane, an 8-foot wide lane, a 10-foot wide lane, or a 12-foot wide lane. Next, you can see it has L or L divided by 2 or L divided by 3, which basically means the full width, or you're going to do half of it, or you're going to do a third of it. Let's give an example of a 55 miles an hour zone with a 12-foot lane. Go down to the miles per hour at 55, scroll over to the lane, and let's say we're going to shut the whole 12-foot lane down. In that case, we're going to have a taper length of 660 feet. Now, if you were only going to shut down half of that 12-foot lane, then it would be 330 feet for a taper. Or if you was only going to shut down a third of that lane, it would be a 220-foot taper, and so on. Moving on to table 3, work zone sign spacing, we can see that if it's 40 miles an hour or less, then the minimum spacing between signs is 200 feet. Now, if it's 45 miles an hour or greater, then the minimum spacing between the signs is 500 feet. And for a limited access road, it's 1,500 feet apart. Table 4 deals with buffer lengths. Now, buffer length is the distance between the taper and the actual space where the work will begin. And as you can see, you have the speeds on the left and the length of the buffer on the right. So if you have a 55 miles an hour zone, then the buffer length would be a minimum of 595 feet. Doesn't mean it can't be longer, but it can't be any less. All right, table 5, clear zone widths for work zones. Now, this is important because it tells us at the end of every shift how far from the work zone we have to leave our equipment parked overnight or till the next shift. So in a 55 mile an hour zone, we would have to leave our equipment parked 24 feet away from the travel lane or the multi-lane ramps. Or if you're in an area that happens to have curb, it would be 4 foot behind the face of the curb. You can also see that if you're in an auxiliary lane or a single lane ramp, that distance would go down to 14 feet. Table 6 gets into super elevations, and Table 7 gets into post-mounted work zone signs, which we're not going to get into in this particular video. Table 8, drop-off protection requirements, is the last one we're going to look at, and a lot of these can be mitigated by simply doing a wedge beside the road for anything 3 inches or greater, as long as it has a slope of a 1 to 4 or less. However, there are other options. So in condition 1, if the drop-off is anywhere between 0 to 12 feet from the edge of the road and it's 3 inches or greater, you can use temporary barrier. If it's 12 foot or greater from the edge of the asphalt, then you can use channelizing devices. But again, in all these cases, you can use temporary barrier wall.